Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the panel on the plight of Turkish women. Thank you for joining us. My name is Alp. I am the director of Alliance for Shared Values. We are a non-profit umbrella for several organizations. It is a Muslim initiative that is open to all, and our partners focus on interfaith and intercultural dialogue. Our panel today features two distinguished speakers, Ms. WOMACK and Dr. SOPHIA PANDYA, whom I will introduce after my general introduction. And we have background music. All right, that's okay. Ms. WOMACK will talk about the experience of women of Turkey who have been incarcerated on political grounds and subjected to human rights violations. And Dr. Pandya will talk about their experiences in Turkey outside of prison and the plight of those who escaped the country, and overall how women cope with their challenges through the power of religion and spirituality. I will give a background on the authoritarian drift that resulted in these gross human rights violations that affected millions, literally millions of citizens, especially women, hundreds of thousands of women as well. First, I want to talk about the process of the collapse of the rule of law in Turkey. Observers of Turkey will remember that the current President Erdogan did not start as an authoritarian leader like he is today. So when he formed his party AKP with roots in political Islam, he declared his commitment to democracy, moving Turkey EU membership, enhancing freedoms, and reducing corruption. So these, in Turkish, these three words start with the letter Y. The restrictions on freedoms, corruption, and poverty. The Turkish words are starts with the letter Y. So they were saying we're going to fight against the three Ys: corruption, poverty, and restriction on freedoms. So today, of course, these promises look like a sad joke. Initially, Erdogan surrounded himself with people from a diverse political background to give the impression that he was aiming at an inclusive form of government. But one by one, these people were distanced, or they distanced themselves from Erdogan after seeing his authoritarian tendency. Erdogan started his process of consolidating power. These are the three Ys that I mentioned. He started his consolidation of power with big money. As soon as he had a chance, he began enriching his loyalist businessmen with government contracts and subsidies, and punishing those who did not support him. Because the government plays such a big role in Turkish economy, no corporation can thrive and even survive without government's blessing. His second move was to consolidate the big media companies in the hands of his cronies. He did this by targeting media holdings with government regulatory agencies, and by helping loyalist businessmen acquire their media assets, such as TVs and newspapers. The subjugation of the judiciary and the turning of the judiciary into a punitive weapon or instrument was the next logical step, which he accomplished during 2014 to 2015, 2016 period. With the media and judiciary in his hands, he was able to silence and subjugate civil society groups like his movement by using classical defamation tactics, and political prosecution. His last target was to purge and politicize the military leadership, which he accomplished in 2016 after the July 15 staged coup attempt. The turning of the judiciary into an instrument of political punishment was crucial in his power grab. Turkish judiciary has suffered from bias and lack of independence throughout the history, but what happened during the last 10 years is unprecedented. Mechanically, there were three stages that culminated in the judiciary becoming a punitive political instrument. First stage, changing laws and court systems. Second stage, dominating the High Council of Judges and Prosecutors that control judge appointments. And third, purging all members of the judiciary who are not his loyalists. In late 2013, there were two public corruption probes that named members of Erdogan's power circles as suspects. Erdogan declared these probes as an attempt of a judicial coup by Gülen sympathizers Gülen being the originator of the Hizmet movement in Turkey, in the judiciary. He declared Gülen and his sympathizers enemy of the state and started a hate speech campaign to dehumanize Gülen sympathizers in the eyes of the public. He used terms such as vampires, bloodsuckers, parasites, assassins, and perverts. And you just see on this screen one of those videos that was actually available on YouTube. He used terms such as these blood-sucking vampires on public TV, national TV. Erdogan's existing control over most of the media and the relative stability of the economy gave him the opportunity to shut down the investigations. So the corruption probes did not go anywhere, and dismissed the police detectives, prosecutors, and judges in a big sweep, and then jailed them without any consequences. As a systemic change, at Erdogan's direction, AKP-dominated parliament passed laws to make arrests much easier and to consolidate arrest decisions in the hands of a carefully controlled group of judges. In June 2014, with the law number 6545, a new system of special criminal judges and criminal peace judgeships was created for criminal investigations, which was then abused for political purposes. Instead of a large number of courts spread around the country, a smaller number of courts with fewer judges were to decide arrest warrants. Whereas before it was possible to appeal an arrest warrant at a higher court, now it was left to the same group of judges. The second step of subjugation of the judiciary was the domination of the Supreme Council of Judges and Prosecutors. By forming an alliance with a political party that had many sympathizers in the judiciary, and by bribing some of the remaining members of the judiciary, he was able to place enough loyalists to form the majority in the High Council of Judges and Prosecutors in October 2014. This majority in the High Council gave him the opportunity to take the last step, that is, shuffle, dismiss, or punish those judges who did not follow the government's line. After this purge, no judge dared to make decisions contrary to Erdogan's wishes, and prosecutions became a political instrument. So the suffering of women that VONYA and SOPHIA will talk about is a result of this systemic change in the judiciary. After July 15 stage coup attempt, the government took 3 steps that facilitated mass punishment campaign involving gross human rights abuses. First, through the presidential directives with the force of law, as is known in Turkish as KHK, presidential directives with the force of law. Hundreds of thousands of citizens were blacklisted and subjected to political prosecution, and all of their rights were denied. They were essentially condemned to a social death. Secondly, the government officially suspended safeguards against torture, the safeguards that protected detainees and prison inmates against torture and abuse in Turkey. These were safeguards that Turkey agreed to under international agreements. So the government officially said, we are not following these anymore. An October 2016 report by Human Rights Watch is entitled "A Blank Check: Turkey's Post-Coup Suspension of Safeguards Against Torture." So the government essentially gave a blank check to all security personnel that you can torture whoever you want. Hugh Williamson, Europe and Central Asia Director at Human Rights Watch, summarized the report in his words. By removing safeguards against torture, the Turkish government effectively wrote a blank check to law enforcement agencies to torture and mistreat detainees as they like. The third step, which was taken in parallel to the other 2 steps, was the media defamation campaign. So the third step was a media defamation campaign which justified the persecution in the eyes of the public. So the primary target of this defamation campaign was Fethullah Gülen, an initial supporter of Erdogan for democratic reasons, a principled support. Later on, he became a critic because Erdogan made a U-turn from the democratic path. So Gülen became his main target, and he was targeted in public media defamation campaigns through many years. The gross human rights abuses against anybody sympathetic to Gülen or the movement that he inspired were portrayed as morally justified through this media defamation campaign. Now in Turkey, 3 groups have been the main victims of Erdogan's brutal regime during the past decade. participants of the Hizmet movement, inspired by Gülen, Kurdish citizens, and the journalists. Turkey has been labeled as the worst jailer of journalists in the world multiple times by a committee to protect journalists. The two leaders of the main pro-Kurdish party have been in prison for years. Some Kurdish majority towns have been destroyed in the name of fighting terrorists, killing many civilians in the process and leaving thousands of people homeless. Many Kurdish citizens who do not engage in or condone violence continue to be targeted with terrorism charges. But Hizmet movement has been the primary target of Erdogan regime's persecution and suffered the worst forms of human rights abuses in a mass punishment campaign. The persecution of the Hizmet movement started after the 2013 corruption probes and escalated after the July 15 incident, which is often described as a coup attempt, but we believe a more accurate term would be a staged coup attempt. Using the July 15 incident as a justification, Erdogan government began targeting anybody that they associated with the Hizmet movement, starting in the morning of July 16, the next day after the so-called attempt. For the record, I'd like to note that Mr. Gülen condemned the attempt. Here is his condemnation message. Rejected Erdogan's accusation, invited Erdogan to allow for an independent international investigation. He said, if you allow for an international investigation, I will accept its outcome, and if I am found guilty, I will buy my own ticket and return to Turkey, and you won't have to ask for an extradition. Instead of accepting this invitation, Erdogan government instead opted to spend billions of dollars on American lobbying companies to try to extradite Gülen. Domestically, Gülen was demonized along with the whole Hizmet movement. What happened on July 15 is not my topic today, but let me just say, based on our investigation, that we believe it was a staged coup or a false flag operation. The evidence we obtained suggests that some military commanders made an agreement with Erdogan to mobilize a tiny portion of Turkish military by misleading them, and then abandoned those officers who were mobilized in the middle of the night, let them be charged with being part of a coup attempt. And the high commanders were never charged, never questioned. I'll be happy to respond to any questions at the end of the panel, but let me just remind you that we have a report on this entitled A Genuine Attempt for a Synthetic Mediatic Coup, available on our website on afsv.org. Now, persecution in the aftermath of the July 15 incident was facilitated largely by the so-called KHKs that I mentioned, the directives with the power of the law. And the scale of the persecution is unprecedented in Turkish history. A website called Turkey Purge lists these violations, both in terms of the numbers and also the personal stories of the victims. Turkey Purge lists the number of people dismissed from their jobs since July 16 as of that date, as of that snapshot, as over 150,000. So 150,000 employees of most government positions were purged with no good reason. This includes 5,000 academics, professors. I actually have a personal friend who is a professor of literature who was purged, who was put in prison. 4,000 prosecutors and judges, and 300 journalists. In addition to firing people from their jobs, the government shut down 19 hospitals, leaving all of their doctors and nurses jobless, 15 universities, and over 3,000 education institutions, including over 500 K-12 grade schools. They also have individual stories on this site, but I won't be able to go into those individual stories. Unfortunately, the last time I checked, I found that the site was down for some reason, but you can find, these are some individual stories that are on that site, but you can find these stories well recorded and reported by the books published by Advocates of Silence Turkey, available on Amazon. So you can find many of the individual stories, both of victimization, persecution, and also hope, how these people survived, coped with their trauma in these publications by Advocates of Silence Turkey. Just search with these words on Amazon. You will find many of their publications excellently documented the abuses. In July 2022, the Turkish Minister of Justice announced that 676,411 people were investigated based on suspicion of being associated with the Hizmet movement. Out of these, 332,000 plus were arrested, including over 100,000 women, 2,000 minors, and over 100,000 individuals were found guilty of some crime and sentenced, and 70,000 people were on trial at that time. Now, the size of the Hizmet movement in Turkey is estimated to be around 700,000 adults or so. So we can say that the Turkish government investigated every single participant of the movement with a potential criminal charge, and arrested half of them and imprisoned the majority of those arrested. So this is a textbook example of mass punishment. In addition, 1,500 plus Turkish lawyers have been prosecuted. About 600 of them have been arrested since July 2016, according to a report by Arrested Lawyers Organization based in Europe. I will just mention a few comments by human rights watchdogs and conclude my introduction. The Fountain magazine issued a special issue describing the plight of those persecuted by the Erdogan regime, what happens to them after losing their jobs. They cannot find new jobs, they cannot liquidate their assets, they cannot leave the country, they are stigmatized, they are charged at some point and imprisoned. After coming out of jail, they cannot still find jobs, so on and so forth. Their rights are denied, even medical insurances are cancelled. So, Human Rights Watchdog comments. Reporters Without Borders ranked Turkey as 157th among 180 countries in the world. In other words, among the worst 15% of the offenders of freedoms of journalists, and called it an open prison for journalists. Freedom House degraded Turkey's status to not free and declared that Turkey is the leader among authoritarian regimes in the world in transnational repression, kidnapping people from other countries. So for 3 years in a row, Turkey has been the leader, worse than Russia and China. Human Rights Watch issued several reports on human rights abuses and torture in Turkey. Amnesty International reported on cases of torture in Turkey in the aftermath of July 15 incident. And after these reports, Mr. Taner Kılıç, the chair of Amnesty International in Turkey, himself was arrested by the Erdogan regime. The US State Department's human rights reports also list several types of human rights abuses, such as torture of detainees in official custody, forced disappearances, arbitrary arrest and detention under a state of emergency, executive interference with the independence of the judiciary, political prisoners, including numerous elected officials. United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights March 2018 report estimated that approximately 600 women with young children were being held in detention in Turkey as of December 2017, including about 100 women who were pregnant or had just given birth. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture reported that after torture was widespread, the torture was widespread following the July 15 incident, particularly at the time of arrest and subsequent detention. The European Parliament on March 13, 2019 voted 370 to 109 to formally suspend Turkey's European Union accession process. Several governments, including Norway, Germany, United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia, reached the determination that Hizmet movement participants have a legitimate fear of being persecuted solely due to their association with the movement for no crime, and therefore qualify for asylum. Against these universal criticism and condemnation, Turkish government officials are in a mode of denial, trying to explain away all these reports as the work of Turkey's enemies. I hope and pray that the situation does not get any worse for any persecuted group in Turkey, and now our panelists will detail the suffering of women in particular. So let me introduce our first speaker, Ms. VONYA WOMACK. VONYA WOMACK is an expert on violations of refugee human rights and the executive director of Refugees Unknown, Stories Untold. She has established international social justice initiatives in Haiti and Eastern Europe, developed global leaders in Libya, and is a spokesperson for international human rights in Scandinavia and Europe. She promotes storytelling as a means to find solutions to the refugee crises while providing meaning for those who have experienced trauma as refugees. VONYA incorporates her interest in business and human rights into her adjunct teaching at Villanova University and Cedar Crest College, where she teaches courses in human rights, development, economics, and global leadership. She received her bachelor's degree in science from Eastern Mennonite University and a master's degree from the University of San Francisco. And her organization, the Refugees Unknown Stories Untold, can be reached at refugeesunknown.org. Vonya, please go.
Thank you. All right, well, we'll just leave it here. So I want to ask you a question. Do you believe that diverse faiths and cultures offer unique perspectives on justice, enriching our understanding and fostering inclusivity? I trust your answer is a resounding yes. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here today. So in our diverse world, the tapestry of beliefs and traditions brings invaluable insights into justice. Each color in the intricate weave contributes a distinct hue to our canvas of understanding. By embracing this diversity, we delve deeper into the complexities of justice, creating a more inclusive framework that respects all individuals, regardless of background and beliefs, and upholds the inherent dignity of every human being. Yet, even as we celebrate our shared commitment to justice and inclusivity, we must also confront the sobering reality of human suffering caused by today's most dangerous crisis, authoritarianism and tyrannical regimes. We are all responsible for issuing a call to conscience and standing together to defend all people's dignity, freedom, and human rights. To do this, we must be more knowledgeable about the human suffering in the world and where human rights violations are happening. It's often outside the places that we consciously hear about or witness on the news or social media. In fact, when I speak to audiences in the US and Europe about a silent genocide happening in Turkey, people unfamiliar with human rights suffering will often say, Americans and Europeans go to Turkey for vacation. How can such extreme human rights suffering happen there? I'm here to tell you today that it happens, and the interfaith community needs to speak up about it. We must also demand that we come together to create awareness and call for action and justice for those who lose their dignity in the name of religious or political oppression. ALP provided a conducive framework regarding the collapse of the rule of law, the persecution of minorities, and the Hizmet movement. I will concentrate on women's human rights violations in Turkish prisons, particularly those that are targeted due to their affiliations, such as ideological, ethnic, or religious ties. I will take you on a journey into what is happening to women and children in the Turkish prisons, and will delve into the depths of this crisis through the lens of a groundbreaking study. Now, this research was conducted between August 2022 and October of 2022, using interviews and data by the NGO Advocates of Silence Turkey, with 180 women in prison for at least 6 months and at most 49 months after the failed coup attempt. It highlights the human rights violations that they experienced. I will uncover stories of unimaginable hardships of women who have faced violations that challenge the very principles that we hold dear. Their stories will demand your attention, compassion, and unwavering commitment to justice. Now, I will sometimes use pseudonames because the threat of women speaking out is real, as well as those involved in taking the interviews. And this extends to those who speak about injustice in Turkey and the oppression of the regime. Yes, even here in Chicago, in the United States of America. Now, the women in the study have been accused of being members of an armed terrorist organization because they had a legal bank account. They worked in an educational institution affiliated with the Ministry of National Education. They sent their children to this educational institution, or because they downloaded the messaging app called Bylock, which is like WhatsApp or Signal, if you're familiar with those. Now, sentences range from 6 years and 3 months to aggravated life imprisonment. All these women suffered trauma, and many families were broken up. We are documenting a disturbing reality. The human rights violations, the disregard for dignity of human life are happening in Turkey today. For some time now, the Turkish government has been conducting a systematic campaign to imprison women on fabricated charges as parts of an intensifying witch hunt against critics and opponents of President Erdogan and his ruling Justice and Development Party. The goal of this extraordinary onslaught on women is to chill Turkish society and to intimidate individuals from expressing their rights, like freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and other kinds of liberties. Now, if the regime goes to such lengths as to imprison women who, in some cases, have just given birth or are pregnant and subject them to torture and ill treatment in detention centers and prisons, the prevailing perception will be that no one is safe from Erdogan and the government's wrath. Persecution of women through abuse of the criminal justice system affects people of all ages, 18 to over 80 years old. Most recent detentions targeted a highly educated portion of women's groups, including academics, doctors, teachers, judges, and prosecutors. Now, in addition to being imprisoned on false charges, these women were denied easy access to health care. They were denied the provisions that they were requested. They were separated from their children and their babies, all violating Turkish government's obligations under international conventions and the Turkish constitution. Now, although women are still a minority in Turkish jails, they suffer more since Turkish detention centers and prisons are primarily built to house men, not women. Not only are they subjected to unreasonable restrictions due to the lack of amenities for women, but they also are at risk of the abuse and ill treatment of male guards. Take Garibay Gazar, whose story started in 2014 when she was 21 years old. Her older brother was killed in a protest, and while her family was mourning his death, her older brother was paralyzed by a shooting that broke out at the police station where he was inquiring about the murder of his sibling. Now, by the age of 23 in 2016, Garibay was a representative of the Democratic Regions Party, which is a pro-Kurdish organization in her district of Darje. That year, she was arrested on charges of terrorism based on her political work. Now, according to a criminal complaint that was filed by her lawyers, Garibay objected to her arrest and was subjected to violence by the prison guards. She was dragged to the floor and taken to the sponge room. And that's a room that is prepared for torture. It's insulated to prevent any sound from spilling out. Garibay Gazar was subjected to severe torture, to harassment, and rape while being transferred from one prison to another. She wanted to convey this to her family and lawyers, but she stayed in solitary confinement for 22 days. After leaving solitary confinement, she attempted to write a letter upon which she was taken back to the sponge room for unruly behavior. She conveyed her experiences to her family over the phone as a last resort. Her lawyers had even made 22 inquiries. Now, she remained in solitary confinement where she committed suicide in her cell. The ministry had not opened or read the motions by her lawyers or felt the need to respond to the prison administration. After her death, the torture and discrimination continued, and Garibay Gazar was not given a funeral vehicle. Her family had to transport her body in the back of a pickup truck. Another participant in the study, a 31-year-old expelled teacher, told her experiences, and I quote, "I miscarried in prison. I had informed them that I was at risk of miscarriage when I was arrested, but it was ignored. I was not allowed to take my medication. There was no referral to the hospital for the first 5 days. After 5 days, when the issue was brought up on social media, only then they referred me. Being taken in the cage compartment of a transport vehicle, having a gynecological examination with my hands cuffed, walking around the hospital with 5 Army officials and 2 guards around me." Now, the stories I just mentioned are blatant violation of the right to life. Sick prisoners are not released despite the law, and torture and violent crimes are routinely covered up. There are thousands more outside of this study who have lost children due to mental and physical stress. as well as those who have drowned while attempting to flee the country. I know. I have met them. Women are also exposed to ill treatment and rights violations during arbitrary detention. And why that process is a gateway to further abuse of women in Turkey, I'm going to explain it to you. So this knowledge is important to you as faith leaders, community leaders, ordinary citizens, because when we are armed with knowledge, then we have more insight into how we might, in our own unique ways, make a call to action and contribute to restoring justice and human dignity. So arbitrary detention, what is it? It is a severe breach of human rights that entails the wrongful arrest, incarceration, and imprisonment of someone without appropriate legal reasons to due process. Women have been particularly affected by this issue. Numerous publications and human rights organizations have highlighted examples of these women being detained arbitrarily as part of a broader crackdown on perceived dissent in the aftermath of the failed coup attempt. Many women have been imprisoned without credible evidence, brought up on bogus charges, denied their rights to a fair trial, and mistreated while in detention. These arbitrary arrests violate fundamental justice and human rights principles, and they signify an impact that is on these women and their families' lives forever. Inhuman practices scar bodies and minds. And for the women and children in Turkish prisons, their trauma has now been extended to the following 2 generations. Women with alleged ties to opposition groups, civil society, or institutions considered unfriendly to the government are frequently targeted in these detentions. There's a deeply troubling pattern of labeling ordinary activities as grounds for membership in a terrorist organization. The arbitrary classification of actions, such as working in a private educational institution, participating in religious sermons, or engaging in charitable endeavors like baking cakes and pastries, is evidence of terrorism. Have you ever worked in a private educational institution, or participated in a religious sermon or service, or an event for charity? Did you bake a cake in home economics class, or donated a baked item to a neighbor, or a fundraising sale? I've done every single one of those. If you've done one of those, think of this. In Turkey, that is evidence of terrorism if they want it to be. So this distortion of law made by the arrested women susceptible to unjust treatment, and it cast a pervasive shadow over their families. The negative impact rippled through the lives of these women and their loved ones, leaving behind fractured relationships and a shattered sense of security. Since 2016, over 100,000 women and 2,000 minors were arrested, found guilty of some crime, and sentenced, which does not include the almost 70,000 that are currently on trial. Now, many of these women are well-educated, productive members of society. They contribute to their communities and to their families. They were mothers, daughters, teachers, and professionals targeted merely for their alleged affiliations, which are often hinged on baseless accusations. These women, who should have been celebrated for their accomplishments, found themselves in the crosshairs of a relentless campaign to silence and subdue any opposition. Now, during their time in detention and in prisons, these women experienced unspeakable rights violations. Their stories, recounted in heartbreaking detail, highlight the dehumanizing conditions that they endured. For instance, one woman, a physics teacher, whose husband was also in prison, was severely disabled from a stroke that she got in 2020 from COVID. She was accused of acts, not crimes under the law, such as having an insurance registry, and her husband installing the ByLock app on his phone. For these reasons, she was sentenced for being a member of his men and arrested after the Supreme Court approved her sentence. Now, prisons are where political power produces submissive bodies. Prisons are like barracks for soldiers and schools for students. Institutions where the government disciplines individuals it labels as others are prisons. The government or jail administration accomplishes this through strip searches, physical assault, refusal to treat patients, and intentionally worsening prison circumstances. Power, control, and punishment over women detainees include naked searches, humiliation, and rejecting the assumption of innocence in trials. Here's a story about the prison staff's behavior and how it demonstrates that human dignity is entirely ignored. And I quote a 21-year-old housewife. "I was subjected to verbal insults at the police station, but in the prison I was strip searched, battered, dragged on the floor, about 10 guards, men and women, beating me, pulling my hair, bending my arms. I was kept in the cold for 4 hours in the sponge room with open windows. I have not been sexually harassed by female guards. We weren't doing anything in the private area when the cameras were installed in the vents. When I was thrown into the sponge room, I was kept for 4 hours in the first time and 24 hours the second, and the rooms were monitored with cameras for 24 hours. I even had to relieve my need for the toilet in front of these cameras." Another described the dire conditions in the prison facilities, where toilets were clogged and prisoners were forced to use makeshift outdoor facilities. Pregnant women and their young children were confined to tiny cells without blankets or even enough food or water. Another woman says this, "I spent 18 months in prison. It was a very difficult process for me. 27 people were staying in a 10-person ward. I slept on the floor for the first month. For the first 3 months, I couldn't get used to the smell of iron in the ward and urine and cigarettes on the bed. Doing laundry with bare hands, bad food, phone calls every 15 days, being stuck in a narrow space with 27 women, the sound of iron doors, the sound of the air conditioners, the sound of the courtyard closing, the women crying, the women fighting, the sounds of children, the children asking for the yard not to be closed, crying for more French fries. And I never got used to a lot more things during my time there. I never forgot them after I was released." So for many women, it is not the physical abuse that ruins them. Rather, it is the family separations and the anxiety, but it's their abused senses that drive away their memories and ultimately their purpose in life. A journalist who was detained wrote about a woman who observed another woman who was distraught about her 3.5-year-old daughter. "I've almost forgotten my baby's face. I wish I had brought one of her photos with me," she sobbed. "They would not allow you to do so anyway," said another. "There isn't even a mirror in that room." Yeah, that's right. Turkish prisons are where people can lose sight of their own faces. Another woman talked about the precious knowledge of time. Regardless of whether it was day or night, the light inside the cell was always turned on. We didn't know when it was because our watches were taken away when we entered. We didn't have any way to tell time. We could only tell the time by the sunshine that was reflected on the wall across from our 10-centimeter window. I've heard that the police only let ladies into the public courtyard when they feel like it. So the control and humiliation exerted by prison staff on prisoners exemplifies the more significant issues. These actions violate basic human rights principles, and they demonstrate a disturbing inclination towards revenge and a desire to demean and dehumanize. The ripple effects of these violations have torn apart social connections, leaving these women isolated and subjected to social death. Economic opportunities diminish, and their capacity to participate in public life is unjustly curtailed. This robs them of their agency, and it perpetrates a cycle of discrimination. The trauma and suffering inflicted on these women reverberate through their families, communities, and the broader society. The disregard for human dignity and the systemic erosion of rights undermines the very fabric of a just and equitable society. So it's crucial to remember that behind every statistic lies a personal story of injustice, hardship, and resilience. Ezra was at home with her daughter when the police came to arrest her husband. However, he wasn't there. Both teachers were dismissed from their jobs, and he was hiding in the streets and forests, at friends' houses, extended family homes. Ezra was under a lot of stress. For her brother and her father-in-law were arrested when Ezra was diagnosed with cancer. When Ezra was hospitalized due to the illness, her husband could not visit her due to the risk of arrest. She died at 28 years old, leaving behind a 4-year-old and a husband who couldn't even see her. Having no choice but to flee, her husband escaped to Austria, where he anxiously awaited his young daughter. You can see his daughter is now 8 years old, and the two reunited just 2 days ago. In the face of these sobering truths, we must chart a path toward justice, healing, and redemption. I asked you if you believe that diverse faiths and cultures can offer unique perspectives on justice, enriching our understanding and fostering inclusivity. What is your unique perspective? How can you improve understanding and foster inclusivity? This year's theme at the Parliament of the World's Religion 2023 is to make a call to conscience, to people of faith and to spirit, to the people of Chicago and all the people in the world that must stand together in defense of dignity, freedom, and human rights for all. So what can you do now? So you can stand up to dictatorships and bring attention to those that are suffering authoritarianism. You can raise voices against injustice and challenge the status quo. How do you do that? Hold information centers at your places of worship, your communities, your municipalities, and your work areas. Invite people like me to speak, that have the interviews, that have talked to people. Invite others that are from advocacy or from the policy space. Encourage people to be involved in think tanks and in solutions and to be a part of creating change. Prioritize providing therapeutic support to women and children who have endured the trauma of imprisonment. And this is not just for Turkey, but for those who experience detention before becoming refugees in Europe or here in the United States. Healing is a crucial step to rebuilding lives shattered by oppression. Weave these stories into your cultural fabric, honor these women's dignity, and work towards preventing future generations from enduring similar kinds of discrimination. Our uncovered stories demand immediate attention, unwavering commitment, and resolute determination. Please remember that the struggle for human rights is not isolated to a single nation or to a community, but it is a universal endeavor that binds us all to humanity as family members. As interfaith leaders, our compassion knows no bounds, transcending the confines of doctrine and dogma. We bear witness to the shared human experience. In the face of human rights violations and the haunting echoes of trauma that follow those violations, our hearts must recognize no divisions. In our unity and unwavering commitment to justice, we rekindle the light of hope and healing in the world's darkest corners. So let's embark on a journey of dialogue, a journey of unity and compassion, mindful of our responsibility to safeguard human dignity and address these pressing issues. As we weave together these distinct threads of thought, we create a harmonious symphony of justice, and that resonates through our shared existence, striving for inclusivity and the protection of the most vulnerable. So in closing, let us stand united in our commitment to uphold the values of fairness, compassion, and justice. Through our collective efforts, we can foster a society where the rights and dignity of every individual are respected, and where a commitment to universal principles of law and humanity replaces the arbitrary abuse of power. Thank you.
Thank you, Vonya. Our next speaker panelist is Dr. SOPHIA PANDYA. Dr. Pandya is a professor and department chair at California State University at Long Beach in the Department of Religious Studies. Winner of the 2016 Advancement of Women Award at CSULB from the President's Commission on the Status of Women. She received her BA from UC Berkeley in Near Eastern Studies and Arabic, and her master's and PhD from UC Santa Barbara in religious studies. A Fulbright scholar, she specializes in women and Islam, and more broadly in contemporary movements within Islam. Dr. Pandya, please.
Thank you very much. Everybody can hear me, right? Okay, good. All right, let's go. So first I want to talk about data having to do with refugees. 2023, over 108 million people, or around 1 out of every 100 people are displaced. We've never had so many displaced people in the history of the world. So about 35 million of those are refugees. You know, some of them are internally displaced. Some of them are asylum seekers, but 35 million of those are refugees. And in 2019 and through 2020 alone, just those 2 years alone, after the July 15, 2016 attempted coup in Turkey, around 30,000 Turks fled Turkey for Europe. And I went and interviewed a lot of them in Greece on 3 different occasions in 2018, 2019, and 2021. Some of the art that you're going to see in this presentation is created by refugee children. So you see this one is of a family standing on the edge of a river that they have to cross to get to freedom. All right, so when we think about women and political conflict in general, women and children, especially girls, are the most vulnerable amongst the displaced. Many women and girls fall victim to rape and other forms of gender-based violence. It's a strategy of political conflict. Displaced women also suffer from poverty, family separation, language barriers, a lack of access to resources, and mental health issues. In general, women don't fare well during political conflict. The stereotypical image is that political conflict is carried out by men, that you have 2 rows of male soldiers like aiming guns at each other and shooting, and so that women are spared from this violence. This is very far from the truth. More women and children die from political conflict than men. Okay? So in Turkey, as VONYA pointed out, women are particularly targeted for harassment, rape, all kinds of discrimination, and that's deliberate, okay? So this is a quote by Zeynep, who's a former teacher. All of the names are changed for obvious reasons. So she said to me, she said, "The government tries to scare women first, to spread fear in society. Spreading fear, if it happens to men, that's one thing. But when it happens to women, they have children with them. So it hurts the entire family. It makes the whole family and society scared." And if you think about it, Turkey is a Muslim society. It's a patriarchal society. And so a way to attack a group like the Hizmet movement is to threaten their community's sense of honor. So Turkish men are tasked with protecting their wives and children, and if they can't do that because they have been thrown into jail or because they have to flee the country, there's dishonor involved. And so many of the men that I did interview about this, they wept when they told me about their devastating inability to protect their wives during the purge. And a recurring refrain that I heard was that they didn't mind if they were tortured in jail. They didn't mind if they were arrested, as long as their wives and children were safe. But as VONYA points out, right, their wives were not safe. A lot of their wives were not safe. So Kader is a 32-year-old married Kurdish woman, and she told me that the government does target women with arrest, mistreatment, and rape. Why? Just to spread fear. And she said, quote, "I think this is why they arrest pregnant women. Men can bear it, but women are more vulnerable." I don't know if this is true, actually, because I interviewed men too, and they really couldn't bear it, okay? Nobody can bear it. But she said, men can bear it, but women are more vulnerable. In jail, those children don't see men, and when they are released, they're scared of men, even of their own fathers, which is difficult for the whole family, right? Okay, so this is a story by Daphne about hiding before she, to avoid arrest. So she was 31. She says, we stayed in a house, which was like a jail. We couldn't go out, and our family brought food for us. 2 or 3 times my children became very sick. We couldn't take them to the hospital. I couldn't go out with my children. I didn't buy anything for them. I didn't visit my family. Every second we heard a police siren, we were afraid and tried to prepare ourselves mentally to go to jail. When I heard the doorbell in my apartment, we tried not to make any noise, afraid. People in Greece, even when they're safe, also in the United States, even though they're safe, they tell me from this community, they say that they still feel fear when they hear a knock on the door or if they see a police car. They just have a frisson of terror for a moment, even though they're safe. Here's a story about crossing the Evros River that's the river between Turkey and Greece that many of the refugees that I interviewed crossed in the middle of the night on their flimsy inflatable boats. And I did interview one woman whose son drowned in the river. I interviewed another woman who told me that she can feel the spirits in the river from people that had drowned their past. Indeed, the Evros River is also known as the refugee cemetery. So she says, while we were getting on the boat in the Evros, I felt only the moonlight and my daughter's breath. I was asking her, are you good? Are you okay? How are you doing? She said, yes, Mom, I'm good. For me, this trip started a new part of my life. Since then, I separate my life into before Evros and after Evros. I don't know if after Evros is going to be good. I don't know what difficulties I'm going to encounter. I didn't feel anything. I only saw the moonlight and heard the sound of the river. The moonlight was very bright. I felt very alone. I was scared. So now let's take a peek into these refugee camps. And I did interview a couple of people from refugee camps. They were men, and they said it's like a box, there's a lot of mosquitoes, and basically it's a jail, and they really wanted to get out. I did interview women that had been to a refugee camp, but not while they were there, and they said that they were incredibly dirty, just filthy, that people's children were just urinating on the floor, that they felt afraid, they didn't know when they'd get out. So while refugee camps try their best to accommodate children, some are quite overcrowded and totally filthy. Sometimes families are stuck into camps for years with little hope of getting out. The Lesbos refugee camp was made for 2,000 people, but it houses over 18,000 people. So a lot of people there are actually suicidal, especially those that have been there for years and they just can't get out. So if you can click. One more, yeah. So here's a drawing of a refugee camp. People sleeping. But let's think for a moment about, I'm a religious studies professor, so I have to look at the religious angle of things. So I am interested in the ways in which the community used spirituality to cope. And I'm not saying that spirituality can heal everything. I mean, VONYA talked about the atrocities that happen in jails, and I also interviewed rape victims. Spirituality, of course, helps process pain, but I think people also need mental health treatment. But here's a quote by Rumi. The cure for pain is in the pain. Good and bad are mixed. If you don't have both, you don't believe in us. You don't belong with us. And Rumi also famously has said, pain is where the light comes in. Right? Pain is where the light comes in. And so here you have a drawing by a child who's kind of pulling down the pain to let some light come in. So if we think about spiritual reframing, sociologist Lydia Manning, she identified 3 elements in spirituality that offer people resilience. One of them is divine support. The second is purpose, and the third is gratitude. So divine support allows survivors to feel as though they can rely on God for support through the trauma. Ultimately, they're not completely alone. God is there. And purpose allows survivors to feel as though their experiences are part of God's plan, that there's a reason why this is happening. Many people in the movement told me they felt as though they were being tested for spiritual purposes, or as though they were being cleansed, purified. They learned that dunya is not stable. Dunya means worldliness. Worldliness is transient and unstable, and only the hereafter, the akhirah, is a place of stability, a place of permanence, something that you can count on. And third, gratitude, which allows survivors to remember what they do have, despite what they don't have, despite all the trauma. So when we think about, again, the role of spirituality, and this is an image of Fethullah Gülen, also known as Hoca Efendi, esteemed teacher, and he is the founder of the Hizmet movement. He has said, what you are struggling with here in this world will, in the next world, turn into a sweet tale as you are met with beauty and blessings beyond all visions, sounds, and minds. You will sit and chat, telling each other of these tales of the past. So you'll have your reward. This is just a short period of time that we're here. Later you will be able to talk about it in the hereafter. In his sermon, Fethullah Gülen preached on the spiritual potential of the refugee experience, and he cites the Quranic verse, Surah An-Nahl, and the quote is, those who immigrate to another land for God's cause, after they have been oppressed on account of their faith, we will surely give them goodly residence in the world, and their reward in the hereafter is certainly greater, if only they, all people, knew how great that reward is. He has also spoken of a concept. In Turkish, it's hüzn. In English, we call it sorrow. And sorrow has a special meaning in this context. It can be transformed through hizmet, or carrying out service to others, into hoşgörü, or empathetic pluralistic engagement. It has a special meaning, sorrow, or this hüzn, because it's the human sorrow of being separated from God. So we all have it. We all have the sorrow of being separated from God. We're all trying to reach God again. So ultimately, sorrow is part of the human condition and part of your spiritual journey. So hüzn, when you share it with others, creates a collective identity, which leads to solidarity with others, not just with people in the Hizmet movement, but with all people that feel sorrow. So through this Quranic example, Gülen also preaches that Hizmet refugees should practice active patience, or active sabir, active patience. And that means you don't just sit passively waiting for things to get better. You practice patience while you also try to change things for the better. So here's a quote by Hilal, a history teacher. She said, I learned loneliness. Hajar, Abraham's wife, now I understand her situation. Right? She was cast out into the desert, and had to find water, had to deal with her existential crisis in the desert. So Hilal understood her, right? So she says, I've read about her, but now I have more empathy for Hajar. So it brought people closer to their religious figures of the past. She also said, I learned nothing is as important as Allah. In the past, I thought about this, but I didn't experience this. Other people said similar things to me. They said, We used to hear about Syrian refugees sinking in a boat, but I never actually humanized them one by one and thought about them as people that had names, faces, children, dreams. So in conclusion, a lot of people told me that they did process their pain through their faith, and they made adaptive meaning. More recently, I was in Vancouver, and women told me, I was in a room with just some women talking about this issue, and they said, yes, faith is good, but we all want therapy. They really wanted therapy, but there was some stigma in the Turkish society about going to a psychologist or a psychiatrist. So they were telling me to tell their husbands to let them go to therapy. I thought that was funny and sad, but also funny. Okay, so many also felt that they lived the lives of the religious figures of their shared collective sacred past. They gained a lot of empathy for others, other people that were experiencing displacement or experiencing pain. Or, many people said, oh, you know what, now we understand what happened to the Kurds. They used to complain, the Kurds used to complain in Turkey, and we didn't really take them very seriously. Now, we get it. Maybe the Turkish government did do those things. The Armenians, we get it. Maybe the Turkish government or the Turks did do those things. So they started to have more empathy and opening their minds to the idea that even in Turkey, bad things happened. So they learned that dunya is not important. Dunya means the world, or the material world. It's not important. I mean, think about it. If you were a refugee, the material world failed you, right? The material world failed you. And it was, this idea, what's stable for a religious person? The hereafter is stable. God is stable. This world, the government, sometimes your own family members failed you. So they also spoke of a greater appreciation for and understanding of freedom, justice, human rights, and the Hizmet movement. And here I'm going to conclude. Thank you very much.
You want to go to the next slide?
You can show the next slide. You can just show the next slide, and we can just, leave
Is there another
that there.
one?
Yes.
Is there another one?
This is
No,
Oh,
this
okay.
is it. Yeah, you just can take a look at how to help refugees yourselves. Yeah.
All right. If you can have another round of applause for our speakers today. Thank you so much. If anybody has a question, there's a mic in the center. If you can kindly come to the microphone to ask your question, we'll appreciate.
I want to thank you. I work with young men seeking asylum in the Chicago area, and we partner with a program for young women seeking asylum. So I thank you for your work, and I have great respect for the Hizmet movement. Turkish American Society of Chicago is one of our partners. My heart does break for Turkey. I follow the news closely. Is there any hope at all for change? I know that there's a presidential election coming up. Am I right on that?
It happened.
It happened.
Already. It happened. Already.
You won again. When was that? I missed it.
A couple months ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
May.
so
There's
is there any hope?
There's always hope for change. Okay, that's the short answer, is that there is always hope for change, and sometimes it takes only a few people to make change. So the important thing is to remember that we each hold a tremendous amount of power to be one of those few people that makes change. The one way is to continue to get the word out, continue to hold people to their, people say they have democratic principles, but so many people in Turkey do not. Okay, they just do not. You have, since 2006, you have a stark rise of populist governments and a stark decline in democratic governments. And I think that's because people have lost faith in the institution of democracy to deliver what they want. And they have returned to tribalistic ways of getting what they want, in short. But there's always hope.
If I may add that to that response, the theme of this year's Parliament is defending freedoms and human rights. But this is one value in people's lives. If you were to ask people, I think most people would say, yeah, of course I'm for freedom and human rights. Most people probably would say that. But when it comes to actual decisions, there are other factors. So one complicating factor in Turkish society is that the observant Muslims have been treated like second-class citizens for a very long time. And Erdogan is playing the identity politics game. I am your man. He's giving the message to the observant Muslims that I'm your man, and they are buying this message. And indeed, they are treated like first-class citizens now, as long as they are loyal to Erdogan, of course. So loyalty to Erdogan is the first criteria. Then being an observant citizen is the second criteria. So because of that, and because this persecution doesn't touch their own lives, freedom and human rights can shift or slide to second and third level. Should that be the case? I don't think so. We should all be concerned about the human rights of every human. But in reality, there are multiple dynamics that are playing there. I think one other dynamic is the fact that Turkish economy suffered great crisis prior to the current government. And during the Erdogan's era, there have not been as severe crisis as before. So that's again people prioritizing their pockets over human rights and freedoms. So as long as these dynamics don't change, it's hard.
Can you go to the very last slide of mine? And I'll just kind of reiterate what Sophia said too. There's a famous Dari proverb, and I know that there's a proverb in Turkish, and there's a proverb in French, and it's kind of all along the same lines. And that is, drop by drop a river is made, right? So if you do something, and you do something, and you do something, and you do something, maybe we can get something to flow. I think about this conference and the people that are involved in this conference. Everybody has either a place of worship, a place where they congregate, they've got a place of employment, they've got a neighborhood, different things like that. Small things can really make a difference. And I think that, being in a university setting, and I think Sophia would agree with me too, young people getting involved in this now is a priority. So in those areas, wherever it is that your unique place can be, also think of that and think about bringing young people into the conversation so that they're also educated on what's happening in the places that they don't see, that they don't hear about necessarily, like Turkey. Oh yeah, I forgot to put that up there, I think. I wanted to thank actually, I didn't know if I'd get a question on where did the data come from, but it's from the volunteers, right, of Advocates for Silence Turkey, because they were the ones that did the interviews, conducted the interviews, and did the data collection for the study. So I wanted to make sure that that was out there.
Please go ahead. If you can also introduce yourself, I think that will be very relevant for your question.
Mohammed Çetin. Two simple questions. One, so many Turkish people are unwilling to come to the front on the stage or the podiums to talk about these trials and tribulations because they are scared of something, and you haven't touched on that one. And mostly we trust on the scholars or researchers like you so that you can enlighten the people. So can you just touch on the fact that why so many Turkish people are not so vocal and verbal on podiums and the platforms to express their suffering?
Mm-hmm.
Second, especially after the second election, recent election, presidential election, people began hopeless, desperate, and the refugees, the number will increase, most probably asylum seekers. But there are pushbacks, and you haven't touched on the pushbacks. Mm-hmm. And is there anything that you scholars and researchers in any way help to stop pushbacks? Thank you.
Okay, I just want to say that in terms of the pushbacks, I did interview lots of people who were pushed back and even taken to these strange camps that nobody knows exists, near the border. And not only are they, so a pushback is when somebody's trying to cross from the Turkish side, and when they arrive to the Greek side, the Greek officials actually illegally push them back. And sometimes they take their phones or they escort them all the way back. And sometimes when they return to the Turkish side, somebody calls the Turkish government and tells them to come and pick up these asylum seekers, these Hizmet terrorists. And so that's a phenomenon, and it's actually become much worse in the beginning. Right after the failed coup attempt, there weren't as many pushbacks, but they increased in volume. I don't know, after 2018, 2019, and then there was a lot of them in 2021. So the first thing you asked about, can you just remind us? Why are we not Turkish? Why are VONYA and why are there no Turks up here? So first of all, I want to say that there are some very active people, even in this audience, like Hafsa Girdap. Yay, Hafsa. So even though Hafsa herself has endured a lot of trials and tribulations, she still risks speaking out tremendously at every occasion that she can about what's happening in Turkey, and others like her, and many others like her. But yeah, there's a lot of research that says that if you're unable to speak about what happened to you, and if it's denied at the government level, like in Turkey, they just deny that it's happening, and then you come here to America and you feel kind of invisible, that it compounds your misery. So I was just talking to a girl, I guess she's not that little, a 23-year-old woman, actually, young woman, and I'm old, okay? Yeah. So she was telling me how hard it is to be in school here, because she just feels like she just doesn't belong. She's here, she feels like all this whole trauma had happened to her, and yet she feels invisible. She feels like people don't know what happened to her. She's walking along, carrying everything that happened from Turkey, all of the things that she can't say. She's just trying to, while she's in school, going to college. It's a huge burden. And when you can't post on Facebook, you can't post on Twitter or on any social media about what's happening, you just feel silenced, and so it goes inside, and it's not very good for mental health.
Here, sure. So for the first question about Turkish people speaking out, imagine that if you did, and you had family members back in Turkey. Do you know what happens? For those of you that don't know what happens, they'll go get those family members. Why? Because you spoke out. That's why you don't see a lot of people talking about it. And that's why there's a need for people to raise a voice for this. So that would be the first thing that I would say for that. In regards to the pushbacks, the EU is heavily involved in pushbacks here. You've got Frontex, you've got a number of players that are involved. And is the situation getting worse? Absolutely. Does money flow, back and forth between these countries, depending on, who goes where? Yes. Also, I can let you know something you might not be familiar with, and that is that they're actually using refugees to do the pushbacks.
Yeah, that's true.
So Syrian refugees, Afghani refugees, etc., they will use these young men, usually, to do the pushbacks. What happens? Their phones are taken, their money's taken, their belongings are taken. Sometimes they're put into vehicles, they're transported, they have no idea where they're going, masked men. I mean, I could go on in regards to what's happening with pushbacks right now. But that is a big issue, and that's also something that definitely needs to be voiced a lot more. And it's not just Turkish people that are getting this pushback. I mean, we're talking about, people that are fleeing from Turkey as well. One of the things I should say too, though, is that Greece has been a place that Turkish refugees have, sought asylum in. And it has been a place for protection for some people. their integration. They're talking about their integration into Greece and things like that right now, and that's a good thing. That falls on the resilient side, right? You start to see that resiliency happen. You see an NGO pop up. You see people now working with other refugees that were refugees themselves. So those things are encouraging. But like I said, the pushbacks are definitely something that we need to push on, or we need to talk about more.
I just wanted to add something as a Turkish-born person. Although I lived most of my life here, more than 30 years, because I spoke against the human rights abuse of Erdogan regime, I've been blacklisted by the government. I am on the wanted list. I'm literally on the wanted list of the government. And Turkish government also broadcast these lists to other countries. As a result, my name is on some kind of financial list of people under investigation. So because of that, one of my bank accounts have been closed, credit cards closed. And for a long while, my family members in Turkey were afraid to talk to me. They would not want to talk to me. I was talking to them through other phones. Some of my other relatives also have been imprisoned. So you can understand Turkish people who don't want to talk about that.
I have more of a global question.
If you can also introduce yourself.
Oh, hi, I'm Dr. Jen Kilps. I work for I'm the executive director of the Minnesota Multi-Faith Network. I'm wondering, in a global perspective, as far as refugees go, how are the UNHCR and the IOM prioritizing Turkey in migration and resettlement efforts? Is this this fear and this secrecy that seems to be silencing so many people, which is so much of this trauma? Is this dampening the UN's response to what's happening? I mean, is this a silent story? Thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, and I think Vonya, the title of Vonya's book, right, the silent and stories untold. What do you give it?
I'm working.
Silent genocide stories.
Yeah,
untold?
I'm working on a
Yeah.
book right now. It's the silent genocide and the stories behind the statistics.
Yeah. So I mean, I think
So
that's
it's silent.
That speaks to the problem. You know, one of the problems is that it goes back to what I told you at the beginning of my talk. 1 out of every 100 people are displaced right now. Okay, so there's just so many. There's so many stories. So the number of Turkish refugees is minuscule compared to the number of Syrian refugees and Afghan refugees and Ukrainian refugees. Okay, that's the top three: Syrian, Afghan, and Ukrainian. I don't know if it's in that order, but those are the top three. So there's just a much smaller number of Turkish refugees. And that's the problem that Turkey is having in terms of getting the story out about what's happening to them, especially the Hizmet movement. And also compounding that invisibility is the fact that Turkey takes in more refugees than any other country. So if you use the word Turkey and refugees in the same sentence, most people think you're going to talk about how Turkey takes in, so many refugees, almost 4 million refugees, more than any other country. What a great, Devlet Baba, which means the father of the nation, right? He waves his Quran and holds a little Syrian child and talks about how he has helped the whole Middle East. So then it's very hard to get the story out about how this dictator has actually created refugees. Mm-hmm. You take it, Vonya. Yeah.
Ooh, I don't know. I keep hearing this drum, and I'm trying to keep my head in the game here. Yeah. I know. The thing about this too is this political reference is all heavily involved. If you can remember, Erdogan at one point basically said to the EU, "You don't do what I want, then guess what? I'm going to open my doors and everybody's going to come to you," right? So you also have that at play too. You have arms dealings. You have all kinds of stuff that are in that mix. The good thing is that, Amnesty International, for example, I've spoken for them in Scandinavia. So they are involved. There are reports. Advocates for Silence Turkey is an organization run by Turkish refugees themselves. Hafsa actually is here in the front, could talk to you about that too. But that organization is one that puts out reports, right? Those reports then go into United Nations or go into different kinds of human rights committees and things like that. And that the stories are collected, you know, on the ground for that. So there is movement there. Does there need to be more movement? Yeah.
Hello, afternoon. This is Sinan Beytullah from Pennsylvania. I'm very happy to see the human rights issues in the Parliament of the World Religions, and his met is involved in interfaith religions. Very nice development in the dialogue work. We see this. I want to ask Dr. Aslan if there is any new strategy after these elections with different departments of the Hizmet movement, from the mentorship department to intrafaith, from intrafaith to interfaith department, if there is a new development, if you are talking to see, because it's not it's about 5 years of term, if there is any new steps. Well, and by the way, I saw here one of the consulate guy is surviving us as well in here in the United States. Thank you.
So I can say to my knowledge that there is an increasing awareness and desire to form alliances, solidarity around suffering, around human rights abuses. There are many communities around the world who have either experienced or witnessed human rights abuses, and some of these communities have a history of experience of these incidents and events. So there have been initiatives that are started, not necessarily after the last election, but within the last year, let's say, within the last year, to reach out to a broader segment and to reach out to these communities, because the situation in Turkey is not known by most Americans and most of the Western democratic world. Turkey is still one of the better countries in the Middle East. It is a place where you can go for vacation. So the plight of Turkish citizens and the women and the participant movement is not known. When this is known, when people actually come to realize what's really going on, there's a great deal of empathy and sympathy and desire to work together to try to do something. I think now there is, at least for the last year, there is a desire and initiative to form alliances, solidarity around preventing abuses. Yes. I think we are at the end of our time for this panel. I thank also again to our panelists, and I thank you for spending your time with this panel. And we hope and pray that the theme of this conference can inspire many people to serve freedoms and human rights and help us be part of preventing the further human rights abuses. And may you also stay well, stay healthy. Thank you.